It was supposed to be an adventure, a simple weekend trip, just a group of friends, a couple of tents, and the wilderness. But now, standing at the edge of the forest, the towering trees casting long, twisted shadows across the ground, the air felt heavy, unnaturally heavy. Something about the forest was wrong. "All right, team," said Ben, the leader of the group, his voice eager but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "We're here. The forest of lost souls. Should be a breeze, right? A few hours in, and we'll camp at the clearing near the creek." His smile was wide, almost forced, as if trying to convince himself as much as the others. But as the group gathered around him, each face reflected the same uneasy feeling. A group of 5 close friends, Ben, Sarah, Rachel, Tom, and Daniel, had all been looking forward to this escape. The hustle and bustle of city life had drained them, and the idea of disconnecting from everything, of finding solace in nature, had been their perfect plan. The Forest of Lost Souls, a place known for its eerie reputation and strange tales of people who wandered in and never came out, had seemed like a challenge they were ready to face. But as they stepped forward, the forest seemed to take a breath, as if it was alive and aware of their presence. Tom, the quiet one, was the first to notice. "Did you hear that?" he asked, looking over his shoulder. "Hear what?" Rachel replied, adjusting her backpack. "It's just the wind." "No," Tom said, his voice low. "I swear." It sounded like whispering, coming from the trees. The others looked around, unease creeping into their faces. The wind rustled the leaves, but nothing more. Nothing out of the ordinary. "It's nothing, Tom," Sarah said, her tone a little too calm. She adjusted her hat, trying to shake off the tension. "We're just a little jumpy, that's all." Ben cleared his throat. "Let's keep moving. We'll set up camp before nightfall. If we stay focused, we'll be fine." But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting and turning in unnatural ways, as if they were reaching for something or someone. The deeper they went, the darker the forest became. Even though the sun was still high in the sky, shadows stretched and shifted, as if they were alive, playing tricks on their minds. The whispers came again, soft at first, barely audible, like a secret being shared between the trees. But then they grew louder, more distinct, as if the forest itself was speaking directly to them. "Do you hear it now?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. It's like the trees are talking." Ben's eyes flicked nervously from one side of the path to the other. "It's just the wind," he insisted, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He had read the stories, the rumors about this forest, the ones about the people who had ventured in and disappeared without a trace, the ones who claimed they had heard the whispers, felt the trees guide them, and then vanished. "Maybe we should turn back," Daniel suggested, his usual bravado replaced by a growing sense of dread. "I don't like this. Quit being a coward," Ben snapped, trying to sound confident. But the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. "We're almost through. A little further, and we'll be out in no time." They pressed on, though every step felt like a mistake. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees now towering over their heads like dark giants watching their every move. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been, making every breath feel labored. "Look," Sarah said, pointing ahead, her voice sharp. "There's something up ahead." At first, they thought it was just another part of the forest, another twisted tree or rock formation. But as they drew closer, they saw that it wasn't just a tree. It was a figure, standing motionless among the trees, its shape barely discernible in the growing gloom. It was tall, too tall, and it stood unnaturally still, as if it had been waiting for them. Its features were hidden in shadow, but the faintest outline of a face could be seen. A face that seemed wrong, as if it was both there and not there at the same time. "What the hell is that?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it human?" Rachel asked, a tremor in her voice. Before anyone could answer, the figure stepped forward, vanishing into the trees with a suddenness that made their hearts stop. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. The whispers stopped. The wind ceased to blow. "Let's just keep moving," Ben said, his voice unsteady as he took a step forward. The others followed, but the tension in the air was unbearable. They hadn't gone far when they realized something was wrong. The path, which had seemed so clear before, was now gone. The trees had closed in, and the familiar landscape they had walked through seemed to have vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar stretch of thick woods. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice rising in panic. We've passed this spot before. We're going in circles." "No," Ben said, trying to mask his growing fear. "There's no way. We must be close to the clearing." But his words sounded less convincing with every step they took, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. They were lost, and in the forest of lost souls, being lost was the last thing anyone wanted. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder than ever, but now it wasn't coming from the trees. It was all around them, a chorus of voices that seemed to speak in unison, calling to them, beckoning them deeper into the forest. And then the ground beneath their feet shifted. One by one, the earth gave way, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. With a scream, Tom fell, disappearing into the darkness below. "Tom!" Ben shouted, reaching for him, but it was too late. He was gone. The group stood frozen in horror, staring into the blackness where Tom had fallen, when a voice, soft, malevolent, whispered in their ears, "You're all lost now." The ground trembled beneath their feet. The forest was silent now. The air hung heavy, thick with tension, and the only sound that filled the space around them was the frantic beating of their own hearts. Ben's hand, trembling, still reached out into the darkness where Tom had disappeared. His voice barely a whisper, he called out, "Tom, Tom, where are you?" But there was no answer. Rachel's breathing was rapid, panicked, and her eyes darted around, scanning the blackness. "We need to leave. Now. We can't stay here." Ben looked around, his mind racing. The forest had already swallowed them whole, twisting their path until they couldn't tell which direction they were facing. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking and groaning, as if they were alive and watching. "Ben, we can't stay here. Tom's gone. We need to go." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, the fear in her eyes now unmistakable. Ben swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had to keep it together. He had to keep the group moving, focused. "We can't just leave Tom behind. He might still be alive. We have to find him." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. Could they really find him? The forest seemed to close in around them, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Nothing looked familiar anymore. Daniel, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "We're never going to find him like this. We're lost, Ben. We need to get out or we'll end up like him." Ben clenched his fists, trying to suppress the panic that threatened to overtake him. But he knew Daniel was right. They were lost. They had no idea where they were, and the forest wasn't just a place. It was something else, something ancient and alive, something that didn't want them to leave. The whispering returned then. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it filled the air with an unbearable weight. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were words, muttering, chanting, speaking in a language that no human should have ever heard. "What is that? What are they saying?" Rachel's voice was barely a breath as she looked around, her eyes wide with terror. Ben couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. Mocking, sinister, almost as if the trees themselves were laughing at them. "It's just the wind," he said, though even he wasn't convinced anymore. Just the wind. But deep down, he knew the truth. The forest wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and it was waiting. Without warning, the ground beneath them shifted again. The trees seemed to sway in a wind that wasn't there, their gnarled roots twisting and stretching like fingers reaching out to grab them. The air grew colder, and Ben felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Look," Sarah cried, pointing ahead. "There's light. Over there." Ben turned quickly, his heart leaping in his chest. Could it be a way out? A campfire? A road? Anything that could lead them back to safety? He took a step forward and then another. The others followed, but every step felt heavier, as if the forest was trying to pull them back. The light grew brighter, more defined, and soon they could see it. An eerie, pale glow emanating from the heart of the forest. It didn't look like a fire, nor did it seem natural. It was a sickly light, almost like the moon, but wrong. It flickered like a candle in the wind, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. "Is that?" Daniel began, but his voice trailed off as they all stood, rooted to the spot. They moved forward, cautiously, their eyes fixed on the strange light. It wasn't far now, but the closer they got, the more unnatural the forest seemed. The trees closed in, their branches twisting like claws, as if the path was being shaped around them, leading them toward the light as if it was a lure. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. "Stay close," he whispered, though his voice barely carried through the thick air. He could feel the fear gnawing at him, but he pushed it down. They couldn't afford to fall apart now. As they reached the source of the light, they stopped dead in their tracks. It wasn't a fire, and it wasn't natural. It was a circle, a glowing, shimmering ring on the ground, as if someone had drawn it with light itself. The edges of the circle flickered and warped, shifting like a mirage in the heat. "What is this?" Rachel breathed, stepping back. This isn't real." Ben moved closer, his curiosity piqued. The air around the circle felt different. It hummed with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. "Maybe it's a portal," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's a way out." But Ben didn't believe that for a second. No, this wasn't a way out. This was something else. Before anyone could say another word, the ground beneath them rumbled. A deep, low growl echoed through the forest, reverberating in their chests. The trees shook, their branches rattling like dry bones in the wind. And then the whispering returned, louder now, more desperate. "You cannot leave. You belong to the forest now." The words seemed to come from everywhere. The trees, the ground, the air itself. They were suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. Ben turned toward the others, but something stopped him. Something he hadn't seen before. Something moving within the trees. Figures, shadows, shapes that shouldn't have been there, moving in the darkness just beyond the light. And then, a face. It emerged from the trees, pale and hollow-eyed, a face twisted in agony. Its mouth opened, but no sound came, only a horrifying, silent scream. "Ben!" Sarah screamed, her voice high with terror. "Run! Now!" But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet split open, and with a terrifying crack, the earth swallowed them whole. When Ben awoke, he was lying on his back, his head pounding with an unbearable throb. His body ached as if he had been crushed, and for a moment, all he could do was lie there, disoriented and confused. The last thing he remembered was falling, the ground giving way beneath his feet, and the terrified screams of Sarah and Rachel echoing in his ears. Now, though all was silent, he pushed himself up, groaning as he sat up slowly. His hands sank into something soft but damp. Dirt, wet leaves. His heart raced as he took in his surroundings. The trees that had once loomed above them were gone. Instead, the forest stretched out in a way that felt unnatural. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. The very ground beneath him seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy. "Guys," Ben called out, his voice hoarse and weak. "Rachel? Sarah? Daniel?" There was no reply, no movement. His breath quickened as panic started to claw its way up from his chest. The forest around him was different now, darker, colder. The trees no longer whispered. They groaned, their branches creaking like the sound of old bones bending under pressure. But it wasn't just the trees. The earth itself seemed to be alive, shifting and changing beneath him, pulling at his feet. "Ben!" Sarah's voice, weak but frantic, reached him from somewhere in the darkness. He could barely make out the direction it came from, but he wasted no time. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him, and stumbled toward the sound of her voice. "Sarah!" he shouted, pushing through the dense undergrowth. The air was thick with fog now, swirling around him in dense, choking tendrils. Every step he took seemed to sink deeper into the ground, as if the forest was trying to pull him down. The trees seemed to bend closer, their branches now resembling gnarled hands reaching out to trap him. "Ben, help!" The cry came again, this time from the left. Ben pushed forward, his heart racing, his mind focused on finding Sarah. He had to get to her, had to make sure they were all okay. But the further he went, the stranger the forest seemed to get. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, as if they were alive, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He could feel the air growing colder, the humidity pressing in on him, and the whispering returned, louder now, more urgent. It was no longer just a murmur. The voices were distinct, angry, mournful, almost pleading. "Leave, leave, leave, before it's too late." Ben's steps faltered, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped in his tracks, looking around, trying to find the source of the voices. But there was no one. Only the dense fog, the trees, and the suffocating darkness. "Sarah? Daniel? Rachel?" He called again, but his words felt hollow, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. His mind raced. Where were they? Where had the others gone? And more importantly, where was he? He had to find them. They had to be close. Just then, the fog parted ahead of him, revealing a path. A narrow, winding trail that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees on either side of the path were tall and twisted, their trunks thin and frail, as if they had been there for centuries, slowly being consumed by the dark. Felt wrong, but the voices were louder now, urging him forward. A chilling sensation crawled down Ben's spine as he hesitated. There was something about the path, something about this place, that filled him with dread. But he had no choice. He couldn't leave his friends behind. They needed him. With a deep breath, Ben stepped forward, his footsteps crunching softly on the dry leaves beneath him. The air grew colder with each step, and the trees above him seemed to close in, blocking out the faint light that filtered through the mist. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the underbrush. Ben froze, his heart leaping in his chest. His eyes darted to the side, his muscles tense and ready to spring. For a moment, there was nothing. just the sound of the wind through the trees. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something moved. A shadow, a figure, barely visible, slipping between the trees. "Sarah?" Ben called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, but the figure lingered, just beyond the reach of the light, watching him. Ben's instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to forget about the others, and just get out of the forest before whatever it was that watched him could get any closer. But he couldn't do that. He couldn't leave them. He took a hesitant step forward, but as soon as he moved, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. The whispering returned, louder now, swirling around him, growing more frantic. "Don't follow them. Don't trust them. They're not what they seem." Ben's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow gasps as the cold air pressed in on him, suffocating him. He felt a shiver run down his spine, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if it was the cold or the dread that filled him. But then he heard it again, the voice. It wasn't coming from the trees this time. It was behind him. He spun around, but saw nothing. Just the fog, swirling around him, as if the forest itself was closing in. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him like tendrils, pulling at his feet. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Ben gasped, spinning around. But there was nothing there, no one, except for the sound. A low, rumbling growl, rising from the depths of the earth itself. Before Ben could react, the ground beneath him buckled again, and with a sickening lurch, the earth split open, swallowing him whole. Ben's body fell through the darkness, his arms flailing wildly as the ground seemed to give way beneath him. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sensation of weightlessness, his body plunging into a chasm of endless void. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the air, swallowed by the depths. The world around him was a blur, a spinning, twisting whirlpool of shadows. Then, with a sickening thud, he hit the ground. Ben gasped for breath, his lungs burning as if he had been underwater for far too long. His body was bruised and sore, but he was alive, barely. He groaned as he pushed himself to his knees, his head spinning from the fall. The air around him was thick and suffocating, and the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. The ground beneath him was soft, spongy, like wet earth. His fingers sank into the dirt as he tried to steady himself. He could feel a strange, pulsating energy in the earth, vibrating beneath him. It was like the forest itself was alive, breathing with him. The pit was silent now, but that silence was almost worse than the whispers. It was an oppressive stillness, as if the world had stopped moving altogether. Ben forced himself to stand, his legs shaky beneath him. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, and he could barely make out anything beyond the immediate vicinity. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw a faint glow in the distance, a pale, eerie light that seemed to beckon him forward. Without a second thought, he stumbled toward it, his mind clouded with fear and confusion. The air grew colder with each step, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift and twist, making each step more treacherous. The glow ahead of him flickered like a distant candle, flickering in the windless air. But as he drew closer, the light began to distort, shifting unnaturally, like a reflection on water. "Hello," Ben called out, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" His words echoed back to him, distorted, bouncing off the walls of the pit. But there was no answer, only the eerie glow, flickering like the last remnants of hope. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat. The pit seemed to come alive, vibrating as if something huge and powerful was moving below him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he instinctively took a step back, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, pale and ghostly, her face gaunt and twisted, her eyes empty and hollow. Her hair was long and matted, hanging in tangled strands around her face. She was wearing a tattered dress that fluttered in the air, though there was no breeze. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he stared at her. His mind raced, but he couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from her. There was something about her that felt wrong. Her presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his chest. Who are you?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her feet barely touching the ground, her movements unnaturally smooth. As she got closer, Ben could feel the temperature drop even further, a chill that sank into his bones. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and raspy. "The forest is hungry, takes what it wants." Ben stepped back, his heart pounding. "The forest? What do you mean? Where am I?" The woman's empty eyes stared at him with an unsettling intensity. "You're in the pit of shadows," she said, her voice a whisper now, like the wind itself. "A place where the lost souls linger, a place where the forest feeds on the forgotten." Ben shook his head, trying to process what she was saying. He had to find Sarah, Rachel, and Daniel. They had to be here somewhere. "Please," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I need to find my friends. Have you seen them?" The woman's expression remained unreadable, but her lips twisted into a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "They're all here," she said softly, waiting, "but you won't find them. Not unless you're ready to give yourself to the forest." Ben felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The pit seemed to close in on him, the shadows swirling around his feet like tendrils, pulling him toward the dark heart of the place. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What do I have to do?" The woman's gaze flickered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if she was sizing him up. Then, with a sudden movement, she stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward him. Ben instinctively recoiled, but the woman's grip was fast. Her fingers were cold, unnaturally so, like ice against his skin. "You have to let go," she whispered. "Let go of the past. Let go of your fears. Only then will you be free." Ben struggled to pull away, but her grip tightened, and the shadows seemed to close in on him, wrapping around his limbs, holding him in place. "What are you?" he started, but the words caught in his throat. The woman's face twisted in a grotesque smile, her eyes flashing with an eerie light. The shadows around them seemed to grow stronger, darker. They pressed against Ben's skin, crawling beneath his clothes, biting into his flesh. He could feel them biting, clawing, pulling at his very soul. "Let go," she repeated, her voice now a harsh hiss. "Or become one of us." Ben's heart raced, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Couldn't. But the pain was real. The shadows were real. The chill in the air was real. He fought against the pull, his legs shaking. But no matter how hard he struggled, the shadows seemed to wrap tighter, colder, suffocating him. Then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, the ground trembled again. This time it was louder. The pit shook violently, as if something was moving deep below. The woman's face went pale, her eyes widening in fear. She let out a terrified gasp and stepped back, releasing Ben from her grasp. "Run," she whispered, her voice now filled with panic. "Run, before it finds you too." Before Ben could react, the ground beneath him split open again. The pit yawned wider, and from its depths, something rose. Something monstrous, something dark. The ground shook violently beneath Ben's feet as the woman, her eyes wide with terror, stumbled backward into the shadows. The very air seemed to crackle with a dark, oppressive energy, and Ben's pulse raced in his ears, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Something was rising from the pit. The darkness itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if it had a life of its own. Then, from deep within the earth, came a low, rumbling growl, a sound so guttural and full of malice that it rattled Ben's bones. It grew louder, more menacing, until it reverberated through the very core of the forest. Ben's eyes widened in horror as he finally saw it. A massive, hulking figure emerged from the depths of the pit, a silhouette at first, then slowly becoming clearer. The creature was enormous, easily 10 feet tall, its body covered in slick, black scales that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, like coals burning in the dark. A mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth opened in a snarl, and Ben could feel the weight of its hunger pressing down on him. It was like nothing he had ever seen. A monster born from the very essence of the forest, a creature of shadow and darkness. Ben's heart pounded as the beast let out a terrifying roar, its breath hot and foul. He stumbled back, his legs trembling, but he couldn't take his eyes off the monster. It was as if it was drawing him in, holding him in place with its presence. The woman, still in the shadows, whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the roar of the creature. "You have to get out of here. Now, it feeds on fear, on despair. It won't stop until it has you." Ben's mind was racing. Escape. He had to escape. But where? The pit was surrounded by darkness, and the beast was blocking his only way out. His throat felt tight, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and rot. Without thinking, he turned and ran, his feet slipping in the mud as he sprinted toward the faint glow in the distance. The ground trembled beneath him, and he could hear the beast's massive steps thundering behind him. Every step felt like it was shaking the earth, like the very ground itself was trying to pull him back into the depths. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning from the effort. He couldn't hear the woman anymore, only the sound of his own pounding heart and the creature's growls that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. The light was closer now, just a few more steps, but as Ben neared it, he realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't a safe place. It wasn't the way out. It was a trap. The glow that had once seemed like a beacon of hope now flickered ominously. It wasn't a candle or a fire. It was a collection of glowing symbols, etched into the walls of the pit. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, the symbols shifting and changing, as if they were alive. The glow wasn't meant to guide him to safety. It was meant to guide him to the beast. Ben skidded to a stop, his heart racing, but it was too late. The creature's growls grew louder, and before he could react, a massive shadow enveloped him. He felt the heat of the beast's breath on his neck, and the ground beneath him seemed to tilt as he was thrown to the side, slamming into the wet earth. The air felt thick with suffocating darkness, and Ben's vision blurred as he struggled to regain his bearings. His body ached from the fall, but he couldn't stop. He had to get away. The creature was closer now, so close he could feel its rancid breath on his skin. Its eyes burned into him, red and full of hunger. Ben scrambled to his feet, but before he could move, he felt something cold and wet wrap around his ankle. The ground itself seemed to come alive, grabbing him, holding him in place. He looked down in horror as dark, twisting roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around his legs like skeletal fingers, pulling him down. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The beast was almost upon him now, its enormous form casting a shadow over him, its claws like knives gleaming in the dim light. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. He fought against the roots, but they only tightened, dragging him deeper into the earth. And then, just as the creature raised its massive claw to strike, a sudden flash of light blinded him. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ben squeezed his eyes shut, his body frozen in place, but the light didn't fade. It burned through the darkness, illuminating the pit like a blazing star. The roots that had wrapped around his legs suddenly recoiled, pulling back into the earth. The creature let out a howl of fury as the light grew brighter, pushing it back. Ben didn't know where the light had come from, but he didn't care. He seized the opportunity, scrambling to his feet and stumbling backward. He wasn't alone. Through the blinding light, he saw figures moving toward him, silhouettes of people, their faces shrouded in shadow, but their presence unmistakable. They were like ghosts, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their eyes empty and hollow. "Ben!" someone called, their voice distant, like a faint echo. "Get out of here! Run!" Ben's head spun as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The light was pushing the creature back, but for how long? He had no idea. The figures in the distance were moving closer now, but they weren't the people he had come with. They were something else, something that had been here for far too long. He didn't have time to think. He turned and ran, his legs barely able to carry him as he stumbled toward the edge of the pit, the light still burning behind him, holding the creature at bay. But as he reached the lip of the pit, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The forest wasn't the same anymore. The trees, once tall and dark, whispering in the wind, now loomed like towering giants, their bark black and gnarled, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. They seemed to watch him, their eyes filled with malice. The forest itself was alive, and it was coming for him. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled toward the edge of the pit, the terrifying presence of the beast still looming in his mind. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering in voices he couldn't quite understand. The air felt heavy, thick with something dark, something that didn't belong. He dared not look back, afraid of what he might see, but he could still hear the beast's growls echoing through the trees. It wasn't over yet. He had only bought himself a few seconds of freedom, and he knew it. The forest wasn't done with him. His legs felt like lead as he forced himself forward, the roots and underbrush tangled around his feet, making every step feel like a struggle. He could feel the presence of the shadows behind him, closing in with every step he took, as though the very trees were alive, watching him. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that was twisting itself around him, manipulating the world around him. It wanted him to suffer, to feel the terror that came from being lost within it. And it was making sure that every corner he turned only led him deeper into its grasp. A sudden, guttural sound reached his ears. A snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something far more sinister. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as he turned slowly, trying to see through the thick mist that had begun to creep in from the edges of the clearing. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, their trunks gnarled and ancient. But it wasn't the trees that scared him. It was the eyes. They were everywhere. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of movement, a glint in the corner of his vision. But now, as his gaze darted from one tree to another, he could see them more clearly. Hundreds of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring at him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The eyes blinked, one by one, like a wave passing through the forest. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching him, studying him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He didn't know what to do. He had to move, had to keep going. But the forest was shifting. The trees were closing in on him. The path he had been following now disappeared, replaced by a maze of roots and branches. Every direction seemed the same. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into the heart of the forest, further away from any hope of escape. The whispers began again, barely audible at first, like a soft breeze carrying voices from afar. Ben strained to listen, his ears ringing with the intensity of the sound. Not escape. Lost. They're coming. The words were garbled, distorted, like the voices of the dead trying to communicate from beyond the grave. His skin crawled, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He tried to block out the whispers, but they only grew louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. Suddenly, a harsh screech ripped through the air, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. Ben spun around, his heart racing, but saw nothing. The air was thick with dread, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift with every passing moment. The eyes in the trees were watching him, following his every movement. He could feel them, cold and calculating, as if the forest was drawing him into a trap, slowly but surely. But what was the trap? What did it want? Ben's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement to his left. He whipped around, expecting to see something, anything. But all he saw were the trees, the endless rows of gnarled, dark trunks. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. He stepped backward, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when he saw it. A shape, pale and ghostly, flitted between the trees. It was just a blur at first, like a fleeting shadow, but then it stopped, and Ben's blood ran cold. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs and a face that seemed to distort in the shadows. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, locked onto his, and Ben felt a chill seep into his bones. It wasn't human. No, it was something much worse, something that belonged to the forest, to the darkness that surrounded him. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was being controlled by something unseen. With each step, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the whispers fading into an eerie silence. The air felt colder, and Ben could see his breath fogging in front of him, a sign of the unnatural chill that had settled in the air. He wanted to run, to scream, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, his body frozen in fear as the figure drew closer. It stopped just within the range of the dim light, its eyes never leaving his. Ben could feel the darkness surrounding him, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. He couldn't look away. It was as if the creature was drawing him in, hypnotizing him with its gaze. Then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers merging into one, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were slow, deliberate, and they echoed in Ben's mind long after they had been spoken. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat, a promise that whatever had brought him here would not let him leave. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he backed away, the reality of his situation sinking in. He wasn't alone in this forest, and whatever else had been lost in the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching. Suddenly, a deafening crack sounded from behind him, and the ground beneath his feet split open. Ben spun around just in time to see the earth give way, swallowing everything in its path. A deep, guttural roar erupted from the pit, and the creature that had been chasing him was back, its massive form rising from the depths once more. Ben's stomach twisted as he realized he had no way out. The forest was closing in, the trees stretching toward him, their branches like the claws of some monstrous beast. There was nowhere to run. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the whispers returned, louder than ever before. They weren't just voices, they were memories, echoes of souls lost to the forest, their pain and suffering forever trapped within the darkness. And then, from the depths of the earth, came a new sound, a voice, familiar yet twisted. "Ben, you shouldn't have come." Ben's pulse thundered in his ears as the earth trembled beneath his feet. The roar that had erupted from the pit still echoed in the forest, as if the very ground itself was alive. He could feel the vibrations in his bones, like some terrible force was pulling at the fabric of the world, threatening to tear it apart. The creature, the one that had chased him through the forest, the one whose growls haunted his every step, was back. And this time it wasn't alone. Ben stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The words from the figure in the trees, "You shouldn't have come," repeated in his head like a warning he couldn't escape. It wasn't just the forest that was trying to kill him. It was something deeper, something tied to the land itself, something ancient and unforgiving. The figure in the distance, the pale, unnatural thing that had spoken to him, had vanished. But its words lingered in the air, thick with malice and a promise of suffering. Ben felt the weight of those words press down on him, suffocating him. But he couldn't just stand there. He had to move. He had to get away from the pit, from the creature, from the eyes watching him from the shadows. Without thinking, he turned and ran. Every step felt like it took him deeper into the heart of the forest, the trees closing in around him like an impenetrable wall. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning from the effort. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, roots and branches reaching out to trip him, to hold him back. It was as if the forest itself didn't want him to leave. He stumbled, barely catching himself on a gnarled tree trunk, his heart racing. The whispering voices were back, louder now, almost as if they were mocking him. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their meaning deep in his gut. There was no escape. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions now, the trees bending inwards, their limbs like twisted hands reaching out for him. He turned frantically, looking for some sign of the others, but the forest was silent, too silent. His thoughts turned back to the group. They had all been so sure when they set out on this hike. They had joked about how easy it would be, how they would make it to the summit before sunset, laughing and talking as they climbed. But that was before the forest began to change, before the whispers started, before the eyes appeared in the trees, before they became lost. Ben's mind flashed back to that first moment when they had realized something was wrong. He remembered the way the forest had seemed too quiet, the way the trees had looked like they were watching them, as if waiting for them to make a mistake. And then there had been the first voice, a low murmur, so faint that at first he had thought it was just the wind. But then it had come again, and again, louder, clearer, the voices of the lost souls that had been trapped in the forest for eternity. Ben could hear them now, the voices of his friends, twisted and distorted by the forest's darkness. They were calling to him, their voices barely recognizable, pleading for help. Ben, help. The voices were like nails on a chalkboard, scratching at his sanity, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He spun around, expecting to see one of them, expecting to see their faces, anything, but the forest was empty, except for the eyes. The eyes were everywhere. At first, it had been subtle, a flicker of movement here, a glimmer of light there. But now they were impossible to ignore. They gleamed from the darkness, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all watching him, all waiting. Their gaze was unrelenting, cold, and calculating, as if they knew something he didn't. He took another step, then another, his legs shaking. The air felt heavier, as though it was pressing down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. The trees were moving now, too. The branches were twisting, bending towards him, as if they had a mind of their own. Ben stumbled again, but this time he didn't catch himself. He fell. The ground gave way beneath him, and for a split second, he thought he was falling into the pit once more. But the fall wasn't far. He landed hard on the ground, his knees scraping against the dirt. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but the moment he touched the earth, the ground trembled. Something was coming. He looked up, his eyes wild with fear, just in time to see a massive shadow moving toward him from the trees. It wasn't a figure, not like the one he had seen earlier. It was something much larger, something that seemed to fill the entire forest. The ground shook with each step it took. Ben's blood ran cold as the shape moved closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. It was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was huge, with twisted limbs and a hunched back. Its eyes, glowing like embers, burned with an ancient, evil fire. The creature was coming for him, and Ben knew he wouldn't survive another encounter. He scrambled backward, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself to his feet, but the creature was too fast. It moved in an unnatural, jerky motion, as if it was more of a nightmare than a living being. Ben's chest constricted with terror as he heard its voice, low and gravelly. "Your fate is sealed." The words sent a jolt of panic through him. There was no escaping this. The creature was upon him, its massive form looming over him like a dark cloud. Ben could barely breathe, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He glanced around frantically, searching for any way out, but it was too late. The creature reached down with its twisted claws, and Ben screamed, a sound of pure terror and despair. And then, suddenly, there was a sharp, blinding light. Ben felt a force, something unseen, rip him from the creature's grasp. He gasped, disoriented, and when he opened his eyes, the world around him had changed. The forest was gone. The creature was gone. And Ben was standing alone, in the center of a vast, empty landscape, the silence deafening. Where was he? What had happened? The only thing he knew for sure was that the forest of lost souls was still out there, waiting for him, and it would never let him go. Ben's head was spinning. The moment the light had engulfed him, he had lost all sense of time and space. 1 minute, he had been in the forest, face to face with the creature. The next, he was standing in a place so unfamiliar, so still, that it felt as though he had stepped outside of reality itself. The silence here was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a suffocating kind of silence, the kind that presses against your ears, makes you question whether the world is still turning. He stood in the middle of a vast, barren landscape, the ground beneath him dry and cracked. The air was still, but cold, biting at his skin like a sharp wind from an endless winter. He blinked, trying to make sense of what had happened. The forest, the creature, the whispers, they had all vanished, leaving him here, alone. Was this some kind of twisted dream? Or had the forest claimed him, taking him into another dimension, another reality altogether? Ben took a cautious step forward, his shoes crunching on the brittle earth. There was nothing here but the endless horizon, a sky so dark it seemed to swallow everything in its path. No trees, no creatures, just the vast emptiness that stretched on forever. And the whispers, those damn whispers, they were back. He froze, his blood running cold as the faintest murmur reached his ears. It was distant, like a soft breeze rustling the leaves. But there was no wind here, no leaves to rustle. The whispers came from within, from the very air around him. The voice was familiar, the same voice that had tormented him throughout the forest, the one that had warned him. "You shouldn't have come," it said again, only this time, the words were colder, more final. Ben's stomach churned, and he spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing but the barren land and the oppressive silence. He could feel the weight of the voice pressing against him, pushing him down into the earth, suffocating him. A sickening realization began to settle in his chest. The forest hadn't let him go. It had brought him here to this place to show him that there was no escape. The whispers weren't just warnings. They were a part of the forest, a part of whatever darkness controlled this place. He had always heard stories about forests that were alive, places where the trees themselves could speak, where the ground could swallow you whole, where the spirits of the lost could reach out and claim anyone who dared to venture too far. But he had never believed them, not until now. The whispers were growing louder, and Ben's thoughts began to spiral. He needed to move. He couldn't stand here forever. There had to be a way out. The light had brought him here. Surely it could take him back. He looked around, desperately searching for any sign of the path that might lead him out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. No way back. No way forward. Just endless darkness. Suddenly, the ground beneath him rumbled again, and Ben's heart skipped a beat. He was no longer alone. He could feel it. Something was watching him. A shadow loomed in the distance, creeping toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Ben's breath caught in his throat. It was the creature from the forest. Its eyes glowed like burning embers, and its twisted form moved in and out of the darkness, as if it were made of the very shadows themselves. Ben's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. The creature's growl rumbled through the air, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated in his chest. Ben could feel the air grow thick with its presence, could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, pulling at his very soul. And then, in the distance, a figure appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the landscape. But as it drew closer, Ben's heart began to race. It was another person, a hiker just like him. "Ben," the figure whispered, the voice low and haunted. Ben's pulse quickened as the figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, tall and thin, with dark hair falling around her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her clothes were torn and dirted, as if she had been wandering in this place for years. "Who are you?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" The woman didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with something Ben couldn't quite place. Desperation? Fear? Recognition? "You're not the first to come here," she finally said, her voice hollow. "And you won't be the last." Ben shook his head, his thoughts racing. "What do you mean? What is this place? What's going on?" The woman's gaze flickered to the creature that was still advancing toward them, its eyes never leaving Ben. "It's the forest," she said softly. "It doesn't let go. Once it's taken you, you're here forever." Ben's heart sank. "No, I can't be dead. I'm still alive." The woman's eyes filled with sorrow. "That's what we all thought. But once the forest claims you, there's no going back." Ben's world began to spin, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of her words. "But I don't remember dying." "None of us do," the woman said, stepping closer. "We were lost just like you. The forest, it changes you. It bends time, twists memories. You'll forget who you were, what you were, until it's too late. Ben's head throbbed with the weight of it all. The creature was getting closer, its growls growing louder, its claws scraping against the ground. The woman's words echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. He couldn't be dead. He had to get out. He had to find a way back. But the creature was almost upon them now, and Ben knew there was no escape. "Run," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the creature's approaching footsteps. "Run before it's too late." Ben didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. But no matter how fast he moved, no matter how far he went, the forest was always there, watching, waiting, and the whispers never stopped. Ben's legs burned as he ran, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. The cold air felt like daggers against his skin, the forest stretching out endlessly in front of him. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, no matter how fast he ran, the creature was always there, just out of sight, but never far enough to escape. It wasn't the first time he'd tried to outrun something. Back in the real world, he had been fast, faster than most, with years of training under his belt. But this was different. The forest didn't play by the same rules. It had its own laws, its own rhythm, and Ben was just a pawn in its twisted game. With every step, the whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices reaching out from every tree, from the very earth itself. They echoed in his mind, filling him with doubt, confusion, fear. They spoke of things he didn't understand, of lost souls who had once been where he was, who had tried and failed to escape. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden in the dark. The fall was hard, his palms scraping against the rough earth, but he didn't have time to feel the pain. He pushed himself up, hands trembling, and forced his legs to move again. Faster now, adrenaline pumping through his veins. But just as he thought he might make it, just as the edge of the forest seemed within reach, the ground trembled beneath him and the creature appeared. It didn't come in a rush like he had expected, but instead it materialized slowly, as if it were woven from the darkness itself. Its eyes gleamed with malice, glowing like two burning coals, and its long, twisted form writhed and shifted with unnatural grace. It was as if it didn't belong in this world at all, but was just a figment, a shadow that had taken shape. Ben froze. The creature's gaze locked onto him, and he could feel the weight of its stare pressing against his chest. It was like it was seeing through him, past the man he once was, to something deeper, something more primal. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like every fear, every dark thought he had ever had was laid bare for it to consume. The whispers grew louder, then faded, as if they were drawing closer, surrounding him with a sickening hum. Ben's heart raced in his chest. He could barely breathe, could barely think. But then, as if the creature had decided to give him a moment of respite, it spoke, its voice a low growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You cannot outrun what you have already become." Ben's mind reeled. What did that even mean? What had he become? His thoughts were a tangled mess, but one thing was clear. He had to move. He couldn't stop. He had to escape. But his legs felt like lead. His body, heavy and unwilling, refused to cooperate. The creature was still staring at him, its lips curling into a wicked smile, as if it enjoyed the torment, the fear. And then, the voice spoke again, this time softer, almost as if it were comforting. "You are lost just like the rest of us. But you'll understand soon enough." The air seemed to freeze, and for a brief moment, Ben felt as if time itself had stopped. It was the strangest sensation, like everything had shifted, like reality had fractured just enough for him to see the cracks. The creature's eyes narrowed as if it could sense Ben's confusion, his desperation to understand. It moved closer, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling level. Ben could see his breath now, hanging in the air like wisps of smoke. And then, with a sudden movement that took Ben completely by surprise, the creature lunged. Its claws slashed through the air, sharp and deadly, but Ben was already moving. His instincts kicked in, and he dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. He couldn't believe it, he had actually moved. But the creature wasn't done. It wasn't finished with him yet. Ben didn't waste another second. He turned and bolted, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. His mind was a blur, his only focus the rhythm of his breath, the pounding of his feet against the earth, the desperate need to survive. The forest seemed to close in around him, its dark trees shifting and whispering as if they were alive, watching, waiting. The ground beneath him was uneven, the path disappearing into the shadows. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not now. As he ran, he heard something else. A voice, faint but familiar. It was the woman, the one who had warned him before. Her words echoed in his mind like a distant memory. You can't run. Not forever. The words chilled him to the bone, and he pushed himself harder. The creature was still behind him, but he could hear its growls fading, as though it was toying with him, allowing him just enough distance to feel like he might escape. But Ben knew better. It wouldn't let him go that easily. He ran for what felt like hours, the forest stretching on endlessly, with no end in sight. He was running out of breath, his body aching from the strain, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. Not now. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, he saw it. A light, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like a distant star. It was a beacon in the darkness, a sign of hope. Ben pushed forward, his legs pumping, his heart pounding in his chest. The light grew brighter, and with it came a strange sense of calm. He could almost feel the warmth of it, like a hand reaching out to pull him from the abyss. But just as he was about to reach the light, something grabbed his ankle. He screamed, his body jerking as he was yanked back into the darkness. The creature had caught him. The world around him spun, and his vision blurred. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. Ben felt his mind slipping, his thoughts breaking apart as the creature's claws tightened around his leg. "You're mine," the voice hissed, and for the first time, Ben understood what the creature had meant. He had already been lost.